Are you ready to get the support you need for your author career and life? Join international indie bestseller Angela J. Ford and fantasy author Stephanie Wabwa as they talk all things writing, publishing, and the real life of an indie author. Welcome to the Indie Author Lifestyle Show. Living your best indie life starts here.
Hello and welcome to episode 23. Today we have an amazing author who lives in Hong Kong, which we will interview all about series and different genres. But before we get started, Stephanie, how are you? What is new in your world?
Hey, Angela, I'm actually really excited for this interview just because I am a person who will soon be in that same little space where you are writing series and you're also writing in different genres. So I think it's just awesome because right now that's what I'm working on, right? So there are different subgenres. It's all fantasy, but different subgenres of fantasy. And it's interesting because the author we're interviewing, they write series. They don't really have standalones. And I thought I could do standalones. And every time, once I start plotting, I'm like, oh, this is a series. And I turn it into a series. And so that's really fun because that's actually what I'm working on right now. They are the beginnings to different series. And I saw a masterclass by David Baldacci, and he talked about how at any given time, he's a prolific novelist, and what he does is at any given time, he will release a novel in that year from a different series. He as well, he writes mystery and thrillers and suspense in those genres, but he writes multiple series at the same time. And so like he kind of jokes where he says his readers never know what to expect from him because he will release, up to 3 books a year and they never know which series it'll come from. So it's like one thing like he can just like surprise his readers with. And so I think that's super awesome because that's kind of what I have going on right now where I'm writing like the interims of different stories. And so throughout 2020, readers will never know which story they'll get. And so that's just been really fun working on Seraphim Resistance series, working on the Mercenary and the Aryan Empire, and also working on the Scarlet Thread series. So that's what's just been keeping me, busy with all the things, typing fingers. That's what I've got going on. But what about you?
Oh, that sounds like a lot of fun and just really makes me think of the fact that I have 2 series that I've not completed yet. Woohoo. I'm also working on, I guess, diversifying a little bit. I'm really excited because for a long time I've been wanting to work on a serial
Mm.
and I've been just debating what to do because I like writing short stories because it just challenges my brain in a different way because you only have so much time to get from point A and point B. And so I like taking one character and doing that. And last year, back in 2019, I was accepted into the Once Upon an Enchanted Forest anthology.
Mm.
And I wrote a short story for that. And after 6 months, they were like, the rights go back to you. And, you can republish the book if you would like. And I was thinking about it and I was like, yeah, I'll go ahead and republish it. And I have an illustrator, same one you have, who will work on the series cover for that. But I was thinking about it and I was like, I think what I can do is actually turn this into a serial.
Mm.
And one of the requirements for being in the anthologies, I had to write it more like a fantasy romance, which I don't really write fantasy romance. Like I have romance inside my books, which is great. I love writing that. But I haven't written anything that has a larger romance theme. And of course, since I write epic fantasy, of course, there's going to be like the fantasy element. So there will be something big picture going on along with the relationship and all of that. But I was thinking, I really like having different couples in my stories and just kind of going into the minds of different characters. And so I think what I'll do for 2020 is just have a serial that is fantasy romance and really dig into that. It's going to be my fun series. I'm just going to have fun with it. I'm going to write whatever I want. And I hope people will love it because it's just going to be my fun project. And so that is what I'm working on for this month.
That just sounds like a lot of fun. I feel like every author needs to have that, like that one passion project where they're like, I'm just having fun with this. Um, if no one else enjoys this, I do. And so I'm excited to read them. It's interesting because I can always knock romance authors. Oh my gosh, it's so cheesy and they get all the money. But I eat it up all the time. Like I'll read a book and I'm like, okay, so are they going to be together? Are they not? Like I always find myself paying attention to the romance subplots. So as much as I can like tease or make fun of any type of romance, I am suckered by it all the time. I love a good romance. So I'm really excited for them because it's fantasy romance and I can't get away from reading fantasy. I love it too much. Like a book has to have those supernatural elements for me to be interested. So I'm really excited for you to get this series going.
Yeah, and full disclosure, romance is cheesy. Like it was just very eye-opening to me after I was in a relationship for 2 years and then I got married last year, and I was like, sometimes like the things that I feel and like sometimes the things that we say and do are super cheesy. And I was like, I think it just is what it is. And it's kind of hard to write it in a way where it's not, but it's just the things that gets your blood pumping and stuff. And I think after getting married, I'm more excited about writing romance because I feel like I've been through the full cycle now. And I can take some of my experience, but I like kind of like imagining like the different what ifs and really bringing that to life. So anyway, it'll be a fun one. Shut me up before I go on. But yeah, so we can dig into this week's interview with Jordan Rivet, which we'll talk a lot more about series. And, if you want to dig into multiple genres or subgenres within series and the best way to handle it. Before we get started talking on today's topic, here's a word about our indie author lifestyle workshops. Workshops are designed for career authors who want in depth training on certain topics to help you take your career to the next level.
Join us each month to dig into writing, publishing, and book marketing strategies for only $27.99. Plus, get access to the exclusive community. Find out our topic of the month by going to indieauthorlifestyle.com/workshops. Now, back to our episode.
Welcome to the Indie Author Lifestyle Show. We are on episode 23, and today we have a very special guest. I will introduce her, and then we will get right into the interview. Jordan Rivet is an American author of swashbuckling YA fantasy and post-apocalypse science fiction. She has written 16 novels, including Duel of Fire, The Watermite Thief, and Wake Me After the Apocalypse. Originally from Arizona, Jordan lives in Hong Kong with her husband. Jordan, welcome to the show. We are thrilled to have you on, and thank you for calling in. I know it's super late where you are because of the
Oh, thank
time
you so much
difference.
for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you decided to become an author.
Okay. Well, I was not somebody who always planned to be a writer when I was a kid. I always loved reading. I imagined that I was going to be an editor and work in book publishing. But then when I moved to Hong Kong when I was 22, I had all of these new experiences and I started writing just to process being in a new place for the first time and having uprooted my life. I moved here for my husband and we've been in a long distance relationship. And so there were a lot of new things and feelings and just like there's sort of a lot of noise that I needed to process. So I started writing. And then in the process of writing a travel memoir set in Hong Kong, I realized that I just really enjoyed writing full stop. So I eventually tried a couple of different types of writing and worked my way around to writing the books that I really enjoy reading, and that's science fiction and fantasy. So it took me sort of on a roundabout path to get back to writing the books that I always read as a kid anyway.
That is super cool. And so I wanted to ask, what did you start writing first? Was it young adult fantasy or was it sci-fi?
My first series is post-apocalyptic adventure set at sea. So the main character is 22, but it's written in kind of that YA dystopian style. So it was a story that I felt had the kind of vibe of YA books because that was something that I was reading a lot with a slightly older character. I think I eventually learned that it was a lot easier to just write YA style with YA age characters, and it was easier to find a market in that way. So I kind of eventually moved into just writing straight YA. But I think of it as kind of YA for adults. But I think a lot of my readers are adults anyway.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's really cool. We hear of like one of the things we hear a lot of the podcasts is that people talk about how they start writing the books that they want to read. But most of the time, people are writing in just one genre. So I like that you're doing fantasy, science fiction, and you have the post apocalyptic. What kind of led you to dive into multiple genres, I guess, and do more of a mashup?
I always knew that I wanted to write more than one genre under a single name. I think that science fiction and fantasy has so much crossover. There are a lot of people who like to read both. And I felt that I wouldn't enjoy being stuck in one very narrow subgenre for book after book after book. I know some people do that really well and do it really successfully, but for me, I just wanted the chance to try different things and to kind of play around a little bit more. I usually am working on two books at once, and quite often there'll be two books in a different series so that I can kind of let one sit for a while and rest and then work on something else and come back to it with fresh eyes. So I think that being in multiple genres helps with that. I wouldn't say that it's probably the best option if you're trying to like make the absolute most amount of money possible, because it does mean splitting your audience a little bit, but that's okay for me. I feel I'm doing fine, even if my audience is a little bit split, because it keeps me excited about the actual writing.
No, that's really cool. So did you find that was an intentional decision though? Because we've had this actual conversation with other writers where they've chosen to go with a pen name strictly because they want to make sure there is that difference. And so like their audience isn't confused. They're not, commingled, so to speak. But whereas, with what you're doing, you're writing multi-genres under the same name. And I know that going on in the future, I would be doing the same thing, multi-genres, but same name. So did you find that there was an intentional decision behind that, knowing that could probably skew, profitability?
Yeah, I felt that I would not be able to maintain the audience if I tried to split the names too much. And I also felt that going forward, I'm hoping that I'll have, decades worth of career ahead of me. And I feel that if I was always splitting my name too finely, it would just get very, very complicated, and would have way too many branches later on down the line. So I felt it was simpler to keep everything sci-fi fantasy all under a single umbrella. And then I guess my readers would just get used to that. My first series wasn't nearly as successful as my second series has been. So a lot of it was a completely new and fresh audience because I didn't have a lot of readers switching over to fantasy the first time that I made that jump. And then the second time I made that jump was after I'd done two completed fantasy series. And then I released Wake Me After the Apocalypse. Again, not really thinking it would sell because my first post-apoc series hadn't sold, and now it is done well by my standards. So I'm seeing some interesting cross pollination of the books the further I get into my career.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me because I love reading in all kinds of subgenres. And so I don't necessarily just stick to fantasy. Like I love thrillers and I love suspense and mystery. And so it makes a lot of sense that you'll find the readers that really like the different genres that you're writing in because they like your writing, they'll follow you around. But I definitely think that's really brave and really awesome and takes some exploration to figure that out. So with your audiences, do you segment them a little bit just depending on what they're most interested in, or how do you handle that?
I have different segments in my mailing list, for example, but quite often I'll send an update to everybody and I'll try and include a little something for both groups. So I might say, here's a cover reveal for my new post-apoc book, but by the way, here is the release date for the next fantasy or something like that. So I kind of try and keep people informed about both sides of it, knowing that some people will only want to read one genre or will only even want to read one series. So I try and give a little bit of something for everybody.
No, that's cool. And with writing multi-genres, how do you balance that though? Because I know some would say that that's incredibly difficult. Like the fact that you write two books at a time already, some of our listeners are like, I could not do that. That's so much work. How do you do that? So for someone who is probably in the same shoes and they're trying to manage that, what would you give it? Like, what would you advise them how to manage multi-genres?
I would definitely say try and only work on one draft at a time. So I tend to do lots of faster drafts. I know some people can do one rough draft and then one edit and they're done. You will usually do 5 drafts for any given book. So I will do one quick rough draft and then do an edit of a different book and then go back and do the second draft of that book and then go back and do another edit of that book. I think that if I was trying to keep 2 stories straight in my head at the same moment, I don't think that would be effective for me. I don't think I could work on 2 different books in one day. But I think as long as it was a 3 or 4 week period for a draft and then you're done, you're probably sick of the book at that point anyway, put it aside, then switch back to the other book, work on it for 3 or 4 weeks, and again, put it aside. You're probably ready for a break anyway. I think that keeping it segmented like that works for me.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. And that's actually something I may try because I've been just thinking about how to write more than one series at a time. And that sounds like a good way to balance it. So with the writing, do you kind of outline or plot out your story so that when you do sit down for that 3 or however long week period to write, that it's just very easy and very quick, or does it take you a little bit longer?
I do outline now. I think that I've become more and more of an outliner the more that I've written. I used to have a really basic 3-act structure, knowing roughly where a couple of major turning points would be, and now I'm much more detailed in my outlines. I love the Save the Cat method. So for a long time, I was using the Save the Cat screenplay book by Blake Snyder and using the storyboard, the 20-part storyboard that he has in that book. And there's more recently been a book called Save the Cat Writes a Novel by Jessica Brody that takes that format and really breaks it down for novelists. And it's a game changer for me. So I highly recommend it to anybody who wants to outline. That it really helps for me to identify where the big turning points are. And I think the specific reason for that is that if I don't, even if I have a rough sense of the arc of the story, I will not have the first big turning point soon enough, and I'll have a slow, like meandering start as we kind of get to know the characters. So I think forcing myself to know that turning point before I sit down to write is very useful. So I will do an outline, then a quick rough draft, sort of a NaNoWriMo style. I'll write as quickly as possible just to keep up the momentum. And then I will do a much more detailed edit on the second draft. The third draft will be more about polishing and character development and expanding things. Fourth draft will be polishing more. Fifth draft will be polishing more. At some point in there, I'll get feedback from beta readers if I can. And so I just find that going over and over, like trying not to worry about the sentence level stuff until the very end, for me, that is useful.
And when it comes to, okay, so you get your outline together, but you're writing multiple things at the same time. So how do you keep yourself from, I guess, overlapping the 2 worlds and the 2 storylines and making sure that you are actually you're getting through that plot, through that story arc and hitting all of the main points in the stories without basically shortchanging the other?
Mm-hmm. I think that the important thing is to really be fully in the world of each book while I'm working on it. So I try not to think about the other book at all while I'm working on that book. So all of the notes, all of the outlines, everything that's in front of me will all be related only to that world. If it's a later book in the series, I will often read the 2 books leading up to it or the 1 book leading up to it right before I get into the really detailed work. So I think that just trying to be fully immersed into that story world is important. Even if I'm not working on 2 books, I think that's important to just sort of get into the mindset of the story.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So where would you say that you pull a lot of your inspirations from? Because you've already written and published 16 books, which is awesome. And you seem to show no signs whatsoever of slowing down. So where are you kind of getting this inspiration from?
I feel like I get the best ideas while I'm working on something else. So something that I'm either writing or something I'm reading. Also, of course, a lot of inspiration comes from reading other people's work, will spark some connection to whatever idea I had been considering already. Usually before I sit down to outline or write anything, I will have already been thinking about the idea for potentially months while I was working on other things, not actively thinking about it, but just kind of keeping it in the back of my head, kind of cooking. I think of it as the idea just has to cook for a while before I can even sit down and write anything. So that can be sparked from anything. It can be my writing, it can be my reading, and then it, of course, can be things that I see or people I interact with out in the world. Hong Kong is a very interesting and vibrant place. There are all kinds of people from all over the world who live here, and it's really like living in the future because there are big skyscrapers and walkways connecting the buildings. You don't even have to touch the ground to get from point A to point B sometimes. So that all helps, I think, in just sort of providing lots of potential, I guess, fodder for the imagination.
When it comes to writing your stories, how much inspiration do you take from just where you are though? Because I always found that I remember like I stumbled upon your books first, and then we ended up in the same author group, and then like I would find out that you were in Hong Kong, and I thought that was the coolest, little me in America. I was like, oh, that is so cool, she's in Hong Kong. And so I've always wanted to know like how much of that lifestyle just like fuses into your stories.
Yeah, I haven't ever written a book set in Hong Kong. So I'm not specifically writing about the Hong Kong experience, but I think that the experience of being out of place, the experience of moving away from your normal world and interacting in a totally new scenario is one that I find very stimulating. And I think that it's something that you see in a lot of books, whether they're fantasy or science fiction, especially in the young adult genre, because there's so much of a coming of age theme, that when you have the experience of being dropped into a completely new situation, that it challenges you in ways that you don't expect, and it introduces you to people that believe and act completely and totally differently than everybody that you've ever met before. And not just Hong Kong Chinese people, but also lots of British people and French people and Australians and New Zealanders. Lots of people come to live here. So I think that just having that experience of trying to figure out how to relate to people and trying to figure out where you fit in a new place, those core feelings, I think, can be applied in a fantasy or science fiction context. So I think that the experience that I think would not be the same if I had always lived here, if I had grown up here, it would not be special to me in the same way I think that it is now.
Yeah, I think that helps a lot too with writing. I think just the transformation of going somewhere else or like traveling or living or moving across the world like you did.
Mhm.
It just is huge for writing and really just helps stimulate our brains and get into the minds of our characters. So speaking of characters, I want to dive into that a little bit and talk about character development and how you really kind of craft your characters and dig into things from their perspectives. And I'm coming from the point of view where I haven't read any of your books yet. So yeah, just go for it. How do you come up with your characters and their perspectives?
Yeah, for me, I don't usually feel that I have a strong sense of my characters until I get a couple of drafts into the story. So for me, it's very important to sort of feel my way through the way that they are handling the situation that I've put them in. So I think that the situation is important. I might have a really rough sense. So for example, in Duel of Fire, which is the fantasy series that basically was my tipping point series, so probably my most popular book of all. It's a really serious, focused character, who's very dedicated to, in her case, it's professional dueling. So she's a sword fighter. And that is her thing, and she's very focused on it. And then I throw this very serious young woman up against the charismatic, like indolent, kind of lazy prince who doesn't really want to take anything at all seriously. And then just having those two basic broad types knock against each other in a really specific fantasy situation allowed me to sort of grow their characters from that point. So I think that characters have to develop organically to a certain extent. Once I've done a little bit of work, usually after I've written certainly a couple of chapters, sometimes even a full rough draft, I will sometimes try and figure out the Myers-Briggs personality for the characters to kind of help me understand them a little bit more thoroughly. Uh, in other cases, I've tried just specifically to write characters who are potentially just very different from the other main characters that I've written, or as different as possible from myself as a person. Of course, my own personality will come out in characters in different ways, but I've never written a main character who is intentionally me. I don't think that I'm actually very interesting in that sense, so I don't think that that would make a really, really good fantasy book. But of course, I can see that, like, the ways in which over time my personality will come out in the characters. But yeah, so I try and really put them through their paces, put them through the situation, and from that learn more about them. And then sometimes that means going back to the beginning of the draft and changing a little bit of the way they are when we first meet them, so that the actual arc makes a more satisfying journey. So it's
So
all very organic, I think.
So in that sense, do you start the process then with, I wouldn't say like not knowing anything, but do you go into your draft like just with like an initial idea and then you develop as you go, or do you first sit down and you kind of sketch out a few things that you want to know about them and you let that develop organically?
Yes, that's correct. The second one, that I will have jotted down a couple of things, so a basic sense of the type of person that I want to write about, or sometimes it's the particular voice. If there's a particular way of speaking that is coming out really naturally, then I will use that. I personally couldn't sit down with nothing and start writing from nothing, but once I have a really, really basic starting point, kind of like a seed, then letting it grow a little bit. But I do need to start with some kind of seed. So actually, in my very first book, it was I tried to think of who was the person who was most different from myself in my life, and I came up with my brother. And so I wrote a female version of my brother, who, of course, now you can read it. Like, that character, her name is Esther. She's a mechanic on a cruise ship, a post-apocalyptic cruise ship. And my brother is an auto mechanic in Arizona. And if you go and read her, she's not him now, as she's developed, because I put her through the situation. Then, of course, wrote her in my own voice a lot, but it helped to start with who's the most different personality from my own, and that's who I came up with. I don't know if he knows that.
That's hilarious. Actually, that's really cool. And actually, a smart takeaway is like kind of basing it off of a person and then kind of having it change as they go through the situations. Because I'm finding that with my character development, I'm seeing the way the characters react to the situations, and that really kind of highlights who they are. And I mean, there's situations that, we're never going to find ourselves in. So it's just fun to write like that. But that's awesome. So
Have
it
you ever
sounds
tried using a long character info sheet? I know I've seen them before, but I haven't ever tried using one of those where it's pages and pages of information about the characters. Have you tried doing that before?
oh no, I'm a pantser. Oh no, that would never happen.
I wouldn't know what to
I,
say.
I mean, I have done that before. So interestingly enough, because I am a plotter, like to the heart and core, right? And so interestingly enough, my first drafts, like years ago, I would have like pages of information about my characters. And then it's funny because I found myself, I would start drafting, and regardless of what I knew about them beforehand, things changed. And I was like, you're not supposed to be this way. Like, you're supposed to be what I came up with before I started writing. And so I found that now, because I've allowed just a little bit of panting to kind of creep in there. So I've allowed myself to kind of do what you do, which I like. I know the initial information about them, and I do still like garner a bit of extra information, outward appearances, things that happened in the past, things about their family, that sort of thing. And then now I'm finding that I can't start until I know the pivotal moment, right? So then I can, and I need to know what led up to that, so then I can start the story from there and like kick off from there. Because I realize that when I go in without knowing that, like I know all about, what they look like, but I have no idea what brought them here. That does nothing for me. So I used to do those long sheets, but now I'm like, oh, you're not serving me.
Yeah, I think I would just freeze up if I tried to do that. It wouldn't work for me.
Yeah, I just feel like it's just not organic. Like when you go on a date or like you're trying to get to know someone for the first time, you don't pull out this sheet of paper and go, "Okay, all right, what's your favorite color? What restaurant do you love going to?" Like you just don't do that. And so it just feels inorganic to do that for writing. But I like I'm trying to move out of my pantser situation into more of a little bit more of a plotter, but it's good to like know things up front and then allow yourself to go with the flow as you're writing. Which one of the things that I like that you said is that you do so many drafts. And I feel like that really allows you to get to know your characters and the world and the story and really polish your books before you publish them. So, how long does it take you to complete a book if you're going through that many iterations? Mm.
Yeah, I think probably 4 to 6 months. I'm a full-time writer. I do 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Probably 4 to 6 months, depending on whether I'm working on something else at the same time. So I do roughly 3 books a year. And my books are most of them are in the 80 to 100,000 word range. I've had a couple that are over 100,000, a couple that are under 80. But generally that's my sweet spot. So yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's
that's
awesome. That's really impressive.
and I wanted to know, so I've noticed that all of the different genres you've written, all the books that you've written, they're all series. And so one, I wanted to know, why do you prefer series over standalones? And then I have to take that question.
Yeah. Part of it is that is what I read. So I think for me, it's just easiest to write the kind of books that I love to read, and in particular the big fantasy series. They're always in a series. Like I've read a couple really great fantasy standalones, but it feels like the natural way to tell a story to me. And I think the same is true of a lot of the YA dystopian series, certainly, and a lot of science fiction series as well. So part of it is because it just feels right. Part of it is because it's easier to turn a profit if I can basically put everything that I make on book one back into advertising book one over and over again. And then hopefully people will go on to read the rest of the series. So that's part of it as well. My book that just came out on Friday, I'm not sure what day this comes out, but on February 21st, is a little bit different in that sense. It's the sequel to Wake Me After the Apocalypse. And that was a book that I wrote a year and a half ago, and that's a much bigger gap than I normally have between releasing books in a series. It is a book that works as a standalone, and when I originally wrote it, I wasn't sure if it was going to sell or not. So I had an idea for the sequel, and actually it's a trilogy, so I had an idea for the other two books, but it works on its own. So I decided to release it and see if it was going to sell or not, and then if it did, I would go ahead and write the later books in the series, which normally I don't do. Normally it's a linear arc, and I know that I'm going to do, usually by the time I have a rough draft of book one done, I know how many books the series is going to be. So with that one, it's been unusual to go back later and write a book that I may or may not have written if people hadn't actually read it. So it's only been out for a couple days, so I don't know if it's been a mistake or not, but I'm happy with the book as it was. So I think that probably just sticking with series is the right choice for me personally.
Yeah. And then, okay, so sticking with series, how do you plan your series? Because some of them are a trilogy, some of them are like 5 books. So how do you go ahead and actually determine this is how many books will be in this series?
Yeah, usually it's after I've done the first rough draft of the first book, because I do think that in particular with the first time that you're using new characters, you learn a lot and you can go in different directions than you initially anticipated when you first started thinking about the idea. So once I've done at least the rough draft of the first book and I know whether or not I really have something, at that point I will usually write a couple of lines, maybe a paragraph or two for each book to kind of iron out roughly where the series is going to go and how many books I think it's going to be. So I feel most comfortable with trilogies, I think, but with the Steel and Fire series, it was, even when I had a really short rough draft for the first book, I was able to figure out roughly where the characters were going to be for 5 books in total. So I just went with that plan and didn't change from that plan after I had that first book. But I do think that the first book is necessary because you might actually get a lot further into your idea than you realized, and you might realize actually this is a duology. This is not going to stretch for 4 books or 5 books. So yeah, I think that I need to be in the world for a while before I know for sure how the pacing of the story works.
That's a good call. And one of the things that I always get stuck with writing series is that I get tired of my characters. Like they'll be in really fun situations and, they have the character growth and they're developing, they're learning and growing. And I get tired of them and I want to write new characters. So do you ever have that problem? And what do you do to, I guess, keep your stories interesting and keep yourself engaged in them, especially if you have the same characters? They're just progressing over so many different books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, well, part of it is working on different books at the same time. That helps with that, as we already discussed. But I think that the other thing that helps is that, especially in fantasy, it's usually one big, huge, overarching story, and there's a huge battle at the end of it with smaller battles along the way. So the finite nature of the story, I think helps to keep it fresh. I know that some people are really good at writing continuing adventures where there's, a monster of the week, or there's just an episode and then another episode and another episode. I would find that very difficult. I don't know how people do that, because usually there's a big, huge evil at the end that they have to defeat, or discovery that they have to make. And usually there's a romantic arc in my books. I like a good romantic subplot. And then once they get together, it's harder to keep it going after that point without just causing problems for them. Like, it's kind of like when you watch a TV series that as soon as the will they won't they couple gets together, it becomes boring. That's the worry that I have. So I feel that I have to keep it contained and finite. And I know that I know a lot of authors don't have this problem, but this is a problem for me.
Yeah, that's definitely the problem I face, just figuring it out. And yeah, like you said, when I love the romance in my stories, but as soon as they get together and everything's perfect, like, okay, moving on.
Yeah.
It's really fun.
Yeah, no. So when it comes to like developing the story, so let's talk a little bit about world as well, right? Because that is something that has to also be tackled throughout the series. So how do you go about your world building? Like once you get your initial idea with your characters and all of that, how do you go about building that world and also making sure that as well can, stretch out and span throughout these books, right? Assuming like they go on different adventures throughout different worlds. Like for some, like with fantasy it can be easy because they're just doing different quests in different parts of the world all the time. So it's like, oh, new discoveries. But sometimes it may not be that easy. So how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, I feel that it's important for the characters to be actively discovering new information about their own world. So the world is much bigger than they know, and that gives the reader somewhere to go, and it gives the world a chance to develop too. So, for example, in fantasy, it would be learning about elements to the magic system that they didn't know about, or discovering a new part of the magic system, or a new way that people that they've never met before use it, or so there's always somewhere new and somewhere to go. If I started with a very static situation where here's the magic and it doesn't change, the character just has to learn to use it, I would find that harder to sustain, I think. So having them actively make new discoveries that are groundbreaking for that world, I think is a useful trick for me. I'm currently writing a spin-off for my 5-book Steel and Fire fantasy series, and for that spin-off series, I'm introducing a new element to the magic system that wasn't there before, and so they have a lot to discover as the individual characters, but the readers of the series also have a lot more to discover because they haven't learned that about that world either, because I didn't know about it in the first series.
And how do you go, like, how deep do you go with your world building? Because I know some writers, they like to just surface things is enough, right? Like, as the character can hint at some things or visit a few places, and that's perfectly fine. They don't get too detailed. They don't really describe like too much of where they are. They focus mainly on what the character is doing, what is progressing that scene, right? Whereas people like me, I love a good detailed world. Like I love to be able to just sit there and completely visualize what it is I'm reading. So how deep do you go with it, and when do you think you reach a point where like, okay, it's becoming more about the world and less about the characters, so I need to like ring it in a little bit?
Hmm. Yeah, I'm the same way in that I love a detailed world. I'm a very visual person, so I can always see it, and I try and describe the world as vividly as I can. I like the fun, cool, like random little stuff that doesn't necessarily matter
Yeah.
much, but it gives texture to the world. Like that's why I like reading fantasy. I like that sense of wonder. I like the cool, magical bits. So I do try and put that kind of thing into my world. So I feel it's important to have the texture. Now, what I don't do is I don't go and write 1,000 years worth of history and like iron out exactly what the economy is in every single iteration of the empire or something like that going back forever. So do try not to get so bogged down in the world building that the story gets lost entirely. And I do think that actually in YA it's useful because it does tend to zero in on only one or two characters, unlike the big, huge, sprawling epic fantasies, which I love to read, but sometimes do become more about the world, for generations and generations, as opposed to the fun, weird little thing that they make out of their magic that makes their life interesting and different in small ways. So I do go a lot into the texture of the world, if not too deep into the history. And I do think that's a very organic thing. So that's something that ideas will often come to me as I'm typing out my rough draft, particularly when I'm writing a fast rough draft, and I'll just say, and I'm going to throw that in there, and I'm going to throw that in there, and then I might go back and make them make sense, or eventually find something that I just made up off the top of my head and find a way to link it back to something later. And I do think that's sort of the fun discovery process as well, is that you can kind of trick yourself into coming up with really cool new ideas
No,
by
that's
sticking in little
cool.
hints that you
Do
don't
you
understand.
do you find that are you intentional with like Easter eggs in your stories? Because I mean you're writing series. So like do you find that when you're going, especially like with the first book, maybe the second one as well, do you find that you're like, okay, I mean the series is gonna span X amount of books, so I want to put this here, this here, this here, or do you kind of just like let that develop as you write?
I do put that stuff in, stuff that will not necessarily pay off right away and little hints. Sometimes I don't put it in until later drafts because I might not know exactly where it's going to go. And I think that's the great thing about being able to do so many drafts and spending time really developing is I can have done two drafts and then realized some big, huge twist that's going to happen in the middle of the second book. And then I can go back into an earlier part of the story and make it seem like I was very clever and just had thought of that, you know, 4 months ago. So it does, I think I do it, but I don't do it just automatically. I have to work for it.
Yeah, that's a lot of fun, to kind of putting in things and then linking them together. I think that's one of the things that I really loved about reading different fantasy series. I love to read like the first book and then get down to like the sixth book and be like, oh yeah, I remember when that happened, or I see how this links together. Because like that kind of thing always got me really excited. And that was a lot of fun. So yeah, so we've covered a lot today. What advice would you have for writers who are kind of starting out and want to get into a career as an author? What advice would you have for them?
If they're interested in a career as an author, it's definitely important not to lay all of your hopes on one book. And I like somebody writing their first book will not believe this. They won't listen to it. It's okay. But I definitely didn't when I was writing my first book, but you really have to plan for multiple books before things really start taking off and before you really figure out what you're doing yourself as a writer. For me, my tipping point, I suppose my point where I started being successful was 6 books in, and if you have all of your hopes tied up in that first book, when it takes 6 months to sell 200 copies, which it took my first book 6 months to sell 200 copies, then you can't let that get into you. You just have to see that as part of the process, that you just need to have more books out there. It's just a small step-by-step process as you develop your readership. And if you stick with it and are intentional about expecting it to take multiple books, that will help, I think, a lot. But just on the writing side, I really think it's important to try not to edit yourself too much on the first drafts, on the rough drafts, and to just have fun. This is why I'm definitely an advocate of the NaNoWriMo style, writing your rough draft as quickly as you possibly can, because you discover a lot, and you also can infuse your work with a lot of momentum that you won't necessarily have if you're agonizing over every single sentence. And it also makes it a lot easier to cut stuff that doesn't belong if you've written it quickly and have not perfected it before moving on with the story. So yeah, those are the main things, but it's important to have fun and enjoy it, because if you want this as a career, it's a long haul. It's a long haul no matter what, unless you're very, very, very lucky. And you should just assume that you're not going to be the one who's very, very lucky. You should assume it's gonna take a while. It's gonna take a couple books.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Sage advice. Because it's true, like about the, authors hanging their hopes on the first book. Like I remember I published my first book and I thought it was going to do all of the things, and it did not. So that was just a lesson I think every author goes through, where they're like, oh, okay, they were right. Should have planned. Got it.
Yeah, and we would say out loud, I'm sure everybody says out loud, oh no, I know it's not gonna, but in your head you're thinking, but everyone's gonna love it right away, and it's just gonna be that one that takes off. And then when it doesn't, I was certainly disheartened. It took me a lot longer to get going than I hoped it would. But it's okay, it's okay in the end. That's just part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful having you on, Jordan. It's so great to hear your sage advice and just how much fun you're having with your career as an author. And we'll definitely include links in the show notes where our listeners can find out more about you, dig into your series, just kind of whatever subgenre they want to dig into. Yeah, that's it. Do you have any last words?
I don't think so. Thank you very much for having me. This has been really fun. I'm glad we got a chance to talk about our jobs, which are just so much fun.
The journey to becoming a full-time author on your own terms doesn't have to be lonely or hard. We have an awesome community where we chat daily, write together, and motivate each other. To be part of this vibrant community of indie authors living their best bookish life on their own terms, go to indieauthorlifestyle.com/inner circle for more information. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love to hear more from you. Leaving a rating or a review helps us to create more great content like this. Be sure to rate this episode and subscribe to the show. Thanks for listening to the Indie Author Lifestyle Show. See you inside the community.